Hello. Hi, everyone. You enjoyed the keynote so far? Everyone having fun at the GDD? Awesome. Well, it's really good to be back here in Prague. I was here last year. I didn't speak, but I managed to attend, so I met a few of you. So there's a few familiar faces in the crowd, but it's really nice to be back here in Prague. It's also nice to see so many Android developers out. So who here has an application in the Android market already? That's cool. Got about half of you. That's really good. And who here came to the GDD last year? Lots of you. And who here saw Roman Nurek doing the similar talk on accents in the Android UI last year? Okay, that's you. But so it's really good. So hopefully those people can understand, they enjoyed that talk and they hopefully got a lot out of it and they went away and implemented some of the tips and tricks you picked up and hopefully you saw some benefit and you think your apps got better because of it. I think it's great to see so many of you recognizing the importance of design. I think one of the stats that stuck out from the keynote earlier is 300,000 applications in the Android market, 300,000 apps that you want to be found in. So you need to be doing something to make your app stand out, to signal that your app is high quality, to signal that users are going to use and love it. And you have a very short time to do that. Usually it's kind of in your market listing or the first couple of minutes of a user using your app, they'll make a decision. Is this app good? Is this app going to work for me? So I think following some tips like this and designing for an excellent user experience are becoming critical to your application. So my name is Nick Butcher. I'm on the Android Developer Relations team, which means I'm here to help you guys make apps, make the best possible apps you can. So my contact details are up here on the screen. You can get me on Google+ or on Twitter if you have any questions or you want to follow up afterwards. I'll also be around all day. So after this session, we have a number of office hours, I think, just through the partition wall. So come ask any kind of Android questions to myself and my colleagues. And today, I'm going to be talking about excellence in the Android user experience. So I'm going to be focusing on tablets, on Honeycomb UIs. A lot of people are probably thinking, haven't perhaps dived straight into tablet development yet, or waiting for Ice Cream Sandwich, perhaps. A lot of people keep on asking me, what's coming in Ice Cream Sandwich? What's Ice Cream Sandwich going to look like? So it hasn't been launched yet, so I'm not going to be able to talk about it just yet. But what I would say, and what we've said publicly, is that Ice Cream Sandwich is largely going to take the work that we did in Honeycomb and bring it to a broader range of devices. So it's going to look very very similar to Honeycomb. So if you take a look at some of these patterns and techniques which I'm talking about from tablets, and take them to heart, you're going to see the same themes coming through in Ice Cream Sandwich. There's going to be some of the same APIs. So if you write to the same APIs in the tablets, they're going to work the same way on phones as well. So today, I'd like to talk about Honeycomb and its visual style, its look and feel. I'm going to go on to talk about a few patterns that you can use to implement in your applications to make them kind of more familiar and usable for your users. I'm going to talk about describing the patterns and then some tips on how to implement them also. I'm going to go through a few do's and don'ts and practical tips to use within your applications to make them more usable. I'm going to go through an example looking at Google's I/O app, which hopefully lots of you have seen or variants thereon. And then lastly, we're very lucky to be joined by a guest speaker. So a Prague developer house called Sleepbit are going to come on and talk about some of their experiences with designing for Android. Okay. So Honeycomb. Honeycomb launched earlier this year, and it had a very different look and feel to it. It introduced a very distinct look and feel to it. Froyo had a very kind of cartoony look and feel. It was kind of, big icons on a light background. Gingerbread got a little bit more defined with some kind of grey boxes and so on. But Honeycomb was a very, very big departure in the visual style. So this is the home screen on a Honeycomb tablet, and it's kind of the dark theme here. So you see the holographic UI, as we call it. It's all about kind of letting your content bubble up to the surface. There's not a lot of kind of like chrome or boxes or frames around your content. It's just letting your content shine through. It's also a very futuristic style, so it kind of this is the look and feel. It has these kind of neon glows and these 3D elements which sweep in and out. So this is the look and feel of Honeycomb, and I encourage your apps to kind of embrace that and build on top of that. If you take a look at some of the inspiration the designers were looking at when they were designing this holographic UI, you can see, there's lots of this 3D elements coming into play, lots of neon glows. I think they were watching a little bit too much Tron at the time, but you can see it's got a very distinct look and feel to it. And that's very evident if you take a look at the set of widgets you get to build your applications with. So these are some of the standard widgets which come with the Honeycomb SDK. And you can see what I mean about there not being very much Chrome. It's very simple. A text box isn't even a box. It's a line with some edges to it. Buttons are very kind of flat, and they've got a very distinct style. The holographic theme comes in two flavors. So you have the basic theme.holo, which is the dark theme, so kind of the blue accents on top of black. And then there's theme.holo.light, which is this light-based theme. So these are the two kind of like starting points which you build your applications. So as an example, if you look at the email compose window, on the left we have phone from Gingerbread, which you can see there are lots of different boxes, lots of different shades of grey. And if you compare that to Honeycomb, so here the compose window is very, very simple, very sparse, no boxes, not so much color clashing. It just gets out the way. It just lets you get on with the task. So this is the look and feel, the style which I'd encourage you to go for in your own applications to fit in with the platform. So to help you do that, I'm going to talk about a number of patterns which will help you to do this. So hopefully you're familiar with a UI pattern, much like a kind of a software pattern or design pattern that you're used to in software. These are kind of general solutions to recurring problems. By embracing these patterns, your app will seem familiar to your users. They'll instantly just kind of get how to use it. It'll feel intuitive. Not only that, but a lot of these patterns have gained framework support. So not only will they be easier to use by your users, they'll be easier to write by you. Like I say here, these patterns are guidelines, not restrictions. So while we think there will be great benefit to using them, they're not hard and fast rules. So if you, for example, you're designing a 3D immersive shooter game, you might want to design a very specific experience for that. The patterns might not apply. Even if you're doing like an app like Paper Camera, for example, which has a very certain aesthetic to it, it goes for a very certain look and feel. They may depart from these guidelines. But for 99% of the apps out there, which are kind of just using the stock widgets and so on, you will find some benefit from using these patterns. So I'm going to go into these 4 different topics in detail now. So the first one is the action bar. So this is not a new pattern. This is the kind of dedicated horizontal bar at the top of the device, shown here on a phone and on a tablet. We started talking about this pattern last year at Google I/O when we worked with Twitter on their application. We think this is a great pattern for exposing kind of some sense of place and branding. So you get this kind of logo area in the top left. And then on the top right, it's a standard place to look for the common actions that you can perform within the application. Which I just said. But on Honeycomb, with the extra kind of horizontal real estate, there was an opportunity to extend its functionality. So looking at the action bar, you can see it's now made up of 3 areas. So on the left, you have this app icon showing you where you are, sense of place. Next to it, you have this view details section showing you a bit more about where you are and letting you navigate. And on the far right, you have the actions of which you can perform on this screen, giving it the pattern its name. So going through those in step. So by default, you have your application's icon shown here. And I think this is a really good thing. I think it borrows on the metaphors from the web. I think most websites you go to will have have the site's logo in the top corner. And you know that if you click on that button, you know it's going to take you back to the home site, right? And I think this is a good metaphor for users. Users like to have this kind of sense of place and know that I can get back to somewhere, and I never feel lost because I know I can always go back to the start. So by default, that's what the application icon will do. You can overload this metaphor and add this idea of going up one step in your navigation hierarchy. So here in the Gmail example, we have this up arrow, which says I'm going back up one step rather than all the way to the root of my navigation hierarchy. And lastly, you don't just have to show your standard launcher icon. If you have a more branded application and you want to show a richer picture, like YouTube here, it uses a different drawable, so you can set any drawable here. Next up is the navigation section next to it. So this can be simple as just a label showing you where you are. So this is like the screen title, if you will. But there's also a couple of standardized navigation methods. So here we show an example of tab-based navigation in the calendar example, and there's also kind of a drop-down list navigation you can have. An interesting example here I've pulled up showing maps has a search bar just there. And some people get confused that search is an action in some applications, and it's on the left here in the navigation section on maps. So here on the calendar, you see it's over on the right. And I don't think it's inconsistent. I think the reason it's like that is that Maps considers search to be the primary way you navigate within the application, the primary way you kind of get around the data within the application. So it considers search navigation, so it should therefore be on the left. So this is your primary way of getting around the application. And over on the right-hand side, we have the actions. So these are the actions you can perform on the data on the screen you're on. So there's obviously only so much room, and you can either show an icon or some text or both. But if you have more actions than there's available space, you can overflow them into this drop-down area. So the last button on the right is an overflow menu. So any extra actions will be overflowed into there. Pushing that expands it, and you get extra options. You can also set completely custom views on these actions here. So you don't just have to stick with the built-in buttons. You can build some really rich components and have them in there, like the search view, for example. Clicking on it expands out so that you type in place, and you can build your own components like that. And interestingly enough, when people use these actions, they tend to read it from left to right. So if you have one clear primary action on the screen, you want that to be the leftmost option. So for example, in a composed email screen, the clear action is to send that email. So on the left-hand side, you want to have the send action. Okay. So the actions are kind of applied to what's on the screen, but they're not contextual to any selections. For working with selection, there's this new contextual action bar. So if you select a couple of items on screen, so in this example from Gmail, if I've selected a couple of messages, the space transforms into the contextual action bar, occupying the same space, but overlaying the action bar. So again, it's made up of three sections. So on the left, you have this dismiss, kind of a done button, next to which is kind of a selection state. So here it just says 3 items selected, but you could have a select all, select none type control there. And then on the right-hand side, there's the actions to perform upon that selection. So to implement this, you want to look at the action mode class, and this will how to populate it and register callbacks for actions. But if you're working with some of the framework classes, will make it easier to populate this. So if you're working with lists of data, look at the list mode selection mode. So there's a new multimodal selection mode, which will handle populating and showing the contextual action bar when you select items in the list. And you just implement the callbacks for populating and acting on the selections. So to get an action bar in your application from Honeycomb and beyond, all you need to do is to target the theme.holo. Set that theme on your application, and you'll by default get an action bar. And by default, if you target SDK version 11, you'll get theme.holo and an action bar. And then to populate items in the action bar, you just use your standard menu XML, which you're used to using to populate your options menu, and you just add this extra attribute called show as action. And then the items will show up in the action bar. So it's very familiar, very similar to how you might have coded beforehand. And just because it's a familiar way of navigating doesn't mean it has to look the same. You can still customize the action bar to make it fit in with your branding and the look and feel of your application. So we have a blog post on our developers blog describing some techniques to style it. So well, that's great if you want to target from Honeycomb and beyond. If you want to have this action bar pattern in pre-Honeycomb, you've got a couple of options on how to do it. So the first one, and this is the technique we've used in the Google I/O application, is just to write your own. So you basically draw a view which looks like an action bar and has some buttons on the right-hand side, and you wire it up that way. That's one option. Other option, there's a couple of great community libraries out there which will help you to do this. I've pulled out 2 of them, which I like, which are called GreenDroid and Action Bar Sherlock. The last one in particular is great because it lets you write to the Honeycomb API, so just using this show as action in your menu XML, and it will handle populating the action bar. And we started talking about on our blog now preparing for ice cream sandwich. So on the blog post, we basically described that if you write to the Honeycomb API, so using this show as action and so on, then the system will handle how to lay that out on different form factors. So on the blog post, we showed this image, which basically shows on tablet, you have the application icon, some tab navigation, and then 6 items in your action bar, 3 of which are overflowed. So we've said if you write to this API, the Honeycomb API, on a later device, on Ice Cream Sandwich, it may look something like this. So here in the phone, we've kept the same kind of navigation section at the top. The tabs have been flowed underneath, and you see the actions have been compressed down because there's less room. So instead of showing 3 and then 3 in the overflow, there's only room for 2 without the text, just the icons, and then the rest have been overflowed, in this case, the options menu. So the takeaway from this is to think about just writing towards the API and letting the system handle it. So some tips for doing that, we said, is to try and avoid saying show as action always, because there just isn't going to be enough room in some kind of like phone type devices. So where you can, use the if room and with text. So this will let it show it with text when there's room, and if not, it'll compress it down to just the icon. So you obviously also need to provide an icon with your actions as well. The other thing to consider is to writing to the built-in navigation method. So if you're using the tab navigation, the drop-down navigation, which I talked about, then the system's just going to know how to handle that. It's going to know about it, and in a smaller space context, like a phone device, it's going to be able to display it in a certain way. If you're implementing your own bespoke navigation methods, the system might not know how to lay that out in different contexts. So you're going to have to do a bit more work. So where you can, stick to the built-in system navigation methods. So the next pattern I want to talk about is multi-pane layouts. So there's just like a limit to how much information you can fit on screen on a phone. You end up having to break out your workflows into kind of multiple steps or so on. You also end up kind of like using full screen, like letting your text like run all the way across. And when you're working on different sized devices like tablets, this just doesn't look very good. So using multi-pane layouts, it'll let you take advantage of this extra space. Like I say, having this kind of like long runs of text going all the way across the screen looks pretty bad. It's hard on the eye to scan. So by having these multiple pane layouts, you can break that up. It also lets you consolidate multiple screens. So things where you might have had to drill down through a number of steps, you can now have on one screen. And this is great because it lets you retain a lot of context about where the user is. Every time you have a multiple step where you drill down, you kind of lose the context of where you came from. But with like applications like settings, for example, you can remember which section you selected before you get into the deeper section. Another thing to remember when you're doing these multiple pane layouts is to think about the information hierarchy. So users tend to read left to right, so you want to get it from like least to most detail, going from left to right. If you end up kind of like breaking this rule, it just feels wrong. You get this kind of weird, uncanny valley moment. So to power these multi-pane layouts, Honeycomb introduced the Fragment class. So fragments, I think, are one of the most fundamental changes in Android in 3.0. So they basically let you kind of decompose your activities down to smaller kind of units into these fragments. And it lets you kind of like write the unit of functionality once, these like kind of chunks of functionality, and then lay them out differently for different devices. I would say that if you're writing new code now and you're not working with fragments, then you need to start thinking about it. We think fragments are so great that we broke them out from the Honeycomb SDK and released them in the compatibility library. So you can now use fragments back to 1.6. So we really think this is the future and the way to write Android apps in a more kind of like modular and reusable way. So if you're writing any new code now, I'd recommend you be using fragments right now. So a concrete example of how you might do this is, so think about, say, a contacts application, which has like a list view, and selecting it goes down to a detail view. On a tablet with all this extra room, you have the space to kind of put both these list and detail views on the screen at the same time. So this benefits from those things I said. You don't get these long runs of text. It would look pretty bad just having a list view filling up the whole page. And it also retains that extra context. I can remember who I am, so who I selected and who else is near it on the screen at the same time. So to implement that, you need to therefore have some kind of communication between those two fragments. So when I select a user, like a contact in the list, how do I then populate the details view? So to implement that, on a phone, you'd end up having two activities. So each activity would host a fragment, but on the tablet, you'd have one activity with both fragments in at the same time. And just as a note, I would advocate having an activity with a whole fragment in it, launching another activity with a whole fragment, rather than just one activity on the phone, swapping out the different fragments between it. The reason I advocate that is if you do the swapping out, you end up trying to build in a lot of functionality to maintain backstack and to have like natural looking animations, so it looks like this transition. You end up basically re-implementing a lot of work, which the framework does for free if you end up using full screen activities. So yeah, look at that. So to have this inter-fragment communication, there's a few techniques you can use. The first one here is one that we've been using our developer samples quite a lot. So in this example, you have a callback interface, so that basically when the fragment gets attached to its parent activity, it discovers that the parent activity implements an interface and can therefore directly, and holds a reference to the parent, and can therefore directly call callbacks on the parent, and then the parent can then talk to its other children. So that's one way to do it. Another is to use the setTargetFragment method on a fragment. This allows one fragment to talk directly to the other one. So it might set like an action so that when a fragment completes an action, it can return its result directly back to the other fragment rather than having to go via the parent. Lastly, I actually kind of like this approach a bit better, is to use intents to have the fragments talking to each other. So this is great because it allows you to kind of encapsulate your fragment's behavior a lot better. So rather than the fragment having to know about know that its parent implements a certain interface, you can just have the fragment broadcast an intent, and then have the parent activity listen out for that intent, and then act accordingly. So as an example of this, in the contacts example I talked about, you might have the kind of listing fragment and broadcast a view action on a contact URI. You could then have the parent activity listening out for that action, catching it in its on new intent method, and then passing that message down to its detail view fragment. So the advantage here is that the parent always knows about the children, because fragments always exist within an activity, so that's fine. But the advantage here is that the fragment doesn't have to know so much about the parent activity, so it's not as tightly coupled. So I like this technique very much. The other thing that multi-pane layouts help you with is orientation changes. Especially with these kind of landscape, like large 10-inch tablets, the difference between a portrait and a landscape orientation is often quite large. We've also seen a lot of data of how people use tablets differently in the different orientations. When people hold these kind of like widescreen devices in landscape, it's much more of a kind of sitting back browsing. You like to kind of swipe along the long edge of it, and it's kind of like a magazine type experience. Whereas in portrait, it's much more of a reading experience. You're much more kind of like reading a long kind of web page or a message or something like that. So think about how you might build a different experience for these two different orientations. So fragments help you to deal with this with a number of techniques. So if you don't do very much to your layouts, you don't provide a different layout in different orientations, you might end up with this first example, the stretch example. So here, you just define, say, weights to lay out your fragments. And then when you rotate, they just get the same weight in a different orientation. It might work for your content, it might not. Often it doesn't. So one technique you can use is the stack technique. So this basically provides a different layout using the resources framework for landscape and portrait. Here we use this example in calendar. So you have a main calendar view, and then on the right you have like a mini month view and the appointments in that month. And it just wouldn't work very well if you just rotated that to portrait and had them all squashed up. There wouldn't be enough space to see everything. So instead of that, we just restack them underneath. So instead of having like a horizontal linear layout, you end up with a vertical linear layout. The next technique is to use the expand and collapse. If there just isn't enough space when you rotate into portrait mode to display things horizontally, you can just collapse down this column, the leftmost column, into a smaller space. This works really well if you have like a way of representing your information in a more compact way. For example, Google Talk in the left pane shows your contacts. So it has their avatar and the name in landscape. But when you go to portrait and there's less room, it collapses down the name to just the picture, to just the avatar. So because you've got this strong visual representation, you don't really lose too much information, and it works very well. And the last strategy we've used here is the show and hide. If there just isn't enough room to have this two-pane layout, for example, in another orientation, it's fine to just hide one away. Gmail uses this, so if you have a list of messages and you select a message and you have a message body, that's fine when you're in landscape mode and there's lots of room, but when you rotate, there just isn't enough room to see both of those things on the screen at once. So it just gets rid of the message list, and you can concentrate on that reading experience when you're in portrait that I talked about. An important thing to think about when you're providing these different layouts, especially for the last two, for the expand collapse and the show hide, is that you want to retain kind of a feature parity. You don't want to have your users feel lost just because they rotated the device. So to allow this, you need to give them an easy way to get any functionality back. So in the expand collapse example, you might have a re-expand button, so it just lets it kind of come back on screen so they can immediately get back to what you just hid away. Or for the show hide example, we often use the up navigation button I talked about earlier in the action bar to bring back the information that was hidden away. So the next pattern I want to talk about is changes to the app navigation model. So traditionally, So the reason we've changed this is because in Honeycomb, we've introduced lots of different ways to deep link into your content of your application. So in these examples here, we've got these new very rich notifications with these individually addressable buttons on them and so on. You've got these new very rich widgets as well, which let you kind of flick through the content of lists and grids and stacks. And the recent list, which lets you kind of dive back straight into an application you were using before. And the takeaway here is that users are no longer just coming to your app from the launcher. They're no longer just coming in through the front door. They expect to be able to deep link to your into your content, and then navigate from there. Another reason is that Android's always relied on having on users' temporal memory. Where did I just come from? Like a breadcrumb trail. What can I get back to where I was before? But users have this very strong structural memory. They're very good at remembering, oh, I'm in Gmail somewhere, I need to get higher up somewhere in Gmail, but I don't know the exact route I came to get here. So to tap into these features, as well as the traditional Android back button, we introduced this kind of up affordance on the action bar. So this lets you use this kind of structural navigation as well as the temporal back type navigation. So an example of how these are different is think about the contacts application. So if you're looking at your list of contacts and select one, in this instance, hitting back or up does the same thing. It takes me back to the root of the application. But if instead of that, I clicked on the user's email address and it took me to the compose window in Gmail. In this instance, hitting back should take me back where I came from, back to the contacts application. Whereas if I were to hit up, it will take me up within Gmail's navigation hierarchy. Another example, say I'm on one of those YouTube-rich widgets, and I click to go straight to a video. If I hit back, I would expect it to take me straight back to the home screen where I came from, whereas up, which should take me back up within YouTube's navigational hierarchy. So think about the different ways that users are going to come into the content within your application and how you need to provide different methods to navigate once they get there. You also need to look at the intent flags. So using these flags, you can build the right kind of navigation. So for example, if you are using this kind of like home affordance on the action bar, so hit that, it takes you back to the home screen of your application. You want to think about using the clear top flag on your intent when you launch it, so that if you hit back, it shouldn't take me back to where I was. Back from the home screen should always kind of exit out. And the last part I want to talk about is going beyond the list. So list views work very well, and they're often the kind of primary way you kind of navigate around your content on a phone. But on a tablet and larger devices, they don't work so great. Like long runs of text all the way across just look pretty bad. It's also a wasted opportunity. If you think about these kind of really big, beautiful, high-definition screens with really powerful GPUs, it's a real opportunity here to kind of make a much more engaging experience, to really kind of showcase your content. Have these hero moments, as we talk about. So some examples that where we've used this in the platform is, my favorite by far is the YouTube applications. If you've ever used YouTube on the Honeycomb tablets, it's beautiful. You just fire it up and you get this 3D wall of videos and it pans and scrolls all around you. Similarly, Books uses a carousel like that. And top left, we've got an example like the music application, which has a wall of covers which fly around you in a 3D carousel. So if you think about how this is much richer than just having a plain old list, so think about where you can use these moments to really engage your users and really kind of wow them. To make it easier to make these kind of interactions, we've open sourced some code. So at Google I/O, we open source the carousel example. So the top left, so this is like the wall of albums that flies around. You can build these yourself very easy. I've done it, just drop in this library, and then you kind of implement some callbacks of how to populate the images, and like 15 minutes later, you've got this kind of compelling, beautiful-looking application. We've also launched the view pager in the compatibility library. So if you go to the compatibility library, you can build these kind of like horizontally paging views. So I don't know how many developers out there have been asked before to implement horizontally paging, and you try and do it, and you kind of use a gallery view, and it doesn't quite work, and it kind of flings too much, and the snapback's too long. You're like, oh, why can't I just have a paging view like the launcher? Well, now you can very easily. So you can use the view pager from the compatibility library. So if you look at Android Market here from the tablets, it has these very rich banners, which kind of like, really kind of compelling content, very visual for your users when they come in. And, they can scroll through them, or we have it auto-advanced, and it's very, very rich. And you can build those experiences yourself very easily with these new kind of widgets. So those are the patterns I wanted to talk about. One more thing on those kind of wow moments is there's going to be a talk later on about advanced graphical techniques on Android. So I'd advise you to come to that. So they're going to talk about different techniques of building these wow moments, including render script. So yeah, so now some do's and don'ts, some practical tips for you building great user experience in your applications. So do aim for a single APK. So users are starting to expect this, that if I have an application on my phone and then I go out and buy myself a tablet, market's going to offer to restore all my applications. If you kind of create specialized experiences for tablets, a different package name, then they're just not going to know about this richer experience. They're going to end up with a phone version on their tablet. If you launch a single APK, it's just going to kind of restore the same APK, but it's just going to work much better in the new kind of context. To make it easier to build this single APK, look at the compatibility library. Like I say, fragments have been backported to 1.6. There's other great stuff in there, like caches and cursor loaders and so on. So there's lots of good stuff in there, so that will really help you to build this. Also, think about what I was talking about, customizing on top of the base style of the platform. So if you're building an application for Honeycomb, think about that holographic UI I talked about earlier on. Make your application feel right at home in that kind of look and feel. So use those as your base resources and customize from there on to add your branding in. And definitely this one here, do support both landscape and portrait. There's nothing more jarring. I don't know how many of you have had this experience on a tablet, but you're kind of holding a tablet in landscape, and you launch an application, and it kind of is locked to portrait, and it rotates, and it kind of takes you out and ruins the moment for you. So definitely look at supporting both landscape and portrait, and think about providing those orientation-specific layouts I talked about earlier on to optimize for these different orientations. Another good tip, use your dimensions XML. Use the resources framework to do lots of the heavy lifting for you. So a lot of people have used the framework for different image resources. A lot of you probably know about drawable-MDPI and drawable-HDPI to provide different assets. But you can do much, much more with the resources framework. So if you factor out all of your dimensions into an XML file, like dimens XML, this lets you kind of provide different dimensions for different contexts. So if your font sizes or tap target sizes, you might want to put in this dimens file. So here we've got one just in the default values folder, which might run on phones. But then you can provide an overridden version for large devices here in this example. So on tablets, you might want to have a bigger text size and a bigger tap target size. So using the dimensions file, you can factor this out and not have to have lots of switches in your code. And always, always use themes and styles. Always factor out. When you want to kind of like change the look and feel, it's so much easier if you just apply consistent styles. Consistently use the same amount of padding throughout your application to have nicely lined up and padded views. So as I was talking about, think about marrying the base OS style with the look and feel of your application. So here, for example, we're providing some customized assets to style the tabs in your application. So in a phone example, tabs look very different on the phone than they do on the tablet. So base your drawables on the right platform version. So the phone versions, they look like they do on the phone, but for the tablet, we've used the resource qualifier of large MDPI v11 in this example to target Honeycomb devices and say on Honeycomb devices and beyond, I need to base my visual style on this kind of like holographic tabs. And finally, do think about doing and turning on hardware acceleration. So hardware acceleration was introduced in Honeycomb, and it's going to make for a much more responsive user interface. So this is especially important when you have these really high density devices, so big 1280 by 800 displays or whatever future devices come out with very high pixel densities. This is going to make a real difference to having a responsive UI. You've got very few milliseconds to actually render and respond to get a very good frame rate. So this is going to really help you out here. The reason we made it an opt-in API, there's a few canvas operations which don't support it yet. So we didn't want to turn it on by default and end up breaking drawing for anyone out there. So for that reason, you can opt in either here at the application level, you can do it at the activity or window level, or even at the individual view level. So if you do have a custom component which is doing lots of canvas drawing, and you are using some of these APIs which aren't supported yet, you can still opt in at the application level, and then just turn it off at the individual view level, so you can opt out there. So I really advocate you guys turning this on, getting a free boost to the speed of running your application, and testing out your app to make sure it all still works and doesn't break. So a few don'ts. So don't assume that API version 11 is a tablet. very, very soon, there's going to be devices on the market with a greater than 11 API, which are going to be phones. So if you hard code this assumption in, it's going to break. Also, don't assume that X large is a tablet. We're now seeing some 7-inch Honeycomb devices. There's a few in the room over there. I advise you go and have a look at them. Like 7-inch devices with Honeycomb, which are just large, not X large. So don't hard code this assumption either. And definitely don't use small font sizes. Nothing looks worse than an application which might look fine on the phone, but you get this tiny little text. So kind of use these larger resources. And watch out for fill parents. Fill parents are a bit of a red flag. On a phone, it might be fine to stretch your text or to runs of text to fill the screen. But on a tablet, it can look pretty bad. So watch out for fill parents as red flags for where you might need to do a bit of work to provide perhaps one of these multi-pane layouts. And lastly, don't think that tablets are just big phones. People are using tablets very differently. You might want to provide a very different experience when you're on a tablet than on a phone. So, like I said, people are coming to use these tablets kind of in the evening. They're kind of sat down, they're more engaged, they're kind of looking for a more casual, engaging experience. So think about what content you might want to highlight. On a phone, it's much more of an on-the-go snacking experience. I might be kind of like, quickly checking and getting in and out. Whereas I might want one of these kind of like hero moments and just to explore and have fun and look around your content. So really reimagine your application. So some examples of building these kind of apps is the Google I/O application. So as I said, this is like one single APK, which just runs very differently if it's on a phone and on a tablet. So here on the phone on the left, we're using the very popular dashboard pattern. So this lets you kind of easily access all the common functionality. Dashboards are great, but they don't look particularly good on tablets. They don't stretch very well. They end up looking very sparse. So we've taken it as an opportunity to provide extra content to reimagine how users are using the app. So as well as the dashboard, we show a live stream of kind of the chat that's going on around the conference. This is also an example of providing an orientation-specific layout. It wouldn't look very good if I rotated that kind of landscape layout and it just kind of squished up the dashboard and you had a very narrow real-time chat session. So instead of that, it uses this stack pattern I talked about earlier to kind of put them underneath each other and have a much better layout. Similarly, on the session kind of time and detail page, with the extra room on our tablets, we can use fragments to put two of these things on screen next to each other. And this is great because here you have this extra context. So when I click on a session and read its details, I can see what other sessions it's up against. I can see that it clashes. I don't lose that context. I haven't had to bury down. So this is a great example of having those more things on the screen at once, helping you out. Similarly here. And the best bit about this application is it's all open source. So if you want to go to this URL and check out the code, you can do. So this is going to give you some great examples of how to use fragments, how to have this multi-fragment communication I talked about earlier, so using intents and callback mechanisms to talk between the two fragments, and so on and so forth. So that's what I wanted to tell you about it, and it's great to be able to talk to you guys and say how important design is. But I think it's also really good to be able to hear it from kind of your fellow developers who are out there making applications. So I'd like to invite some guests from Sleepbit onto the stage who are going to talk about their experience with designing from Android and share some tips and tricks with you guys. So welcome, Sleepbit.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks. All right. So, hello, everyone. My name is Zlepšování. This is my colleague, Jan Jajo, who will be helping me with the presentation today. And we're from a small Czech software company called Sleepbit. I'll attempt to continue the presentation in English since there's a couple of you sitting in here who don't speak Czech. We'll be presenting you our take on Android UI, and we'll do so in a case study using our application called Overview. And this application is a natural family planning charting application. What it does is implements a few fertility awareness methods. And if you didn't understand a word of what I just said, that's perfectly okay. You can just think about it as a tool, a simple birth control tool, or an advanced birth control tool, depending on how well you use it, or a simple menstrual calendar. And so it's targeting a female audience. I can see many of you sitting here females. Anyone? No? All right. Anyway, so we'll be discussing the design and layout of this application. And well, what we've done is we were following the well-known design patterns that Roman Nurik was talking about last year here. It was a very similar talk to what we had here today from Nick, but last year it was focusing on phones. So we thought it might be interesting to see how you can implement what we learned here in a real application. So again, those patterns are well known. There's an action bar, a dashboard, some control icons, and if you take a look at last year's slide and our application screenshots, then it looks quite similar. So when you follow these design patterns, that works quite well for a while. But you might get to a point where you actually need to implement some custom views. So you all know how to implement custom views. It's well documented. You start with overriding some of the well-known methods, on measure, on size change, and on draw. And usually that's where most programmers stop in their apps. And what I'd like to recommend is, if you can, please put in the extra effort into learning about how to scroll your views. You really get a chance to build fancy-looking views, custom views, views that can animate using interpolators, views that can fling. So in order for you to do those, basically what you need to do is you need to learn how to scroll a view. With that, if I can, I'd ask for help to switch over to the overhead projector. So if we could take a look at examples. Thank you. Perfect. So that'd be our application over there. And Jan will be showing you some of what I'm talking of. But again, going back just for a minute to how to scroll and how that is important is, and what it enables you, is if you think of the list view, we should all know how to properly code a list view, right? So if you have a list of 1,000 items, the number of list views actually in memory is always just the number that fits on the screen plus 1, and then you flip the data underneath it. So that's the proper way of scrolling list views fast, right? We all learned that a long time ago. It's been said a million times. If you're not doing it that way, that's very bad, so you should. So if you imagine the list view, imagine the same thing with scrolling views. Normally what happens is you have a bigger view with a big layout, and you lay out the whole thing, and then you have a small screen. And what you do when you use a scroll view is you move around that big view of yours inside the small screen, but the whole view is laid out. Notice it's basically the same analogy as with the list view coded in the wrong way. And what scrolling views enable you to do is, when you have that big view, you don't have it laid out, the whole thing. You always just draw the part that is displayed, and then you redraw, as you scroll around, you're redrawing the parts that you actually need showing. So that's the analogy we figured, that's how we understand scrolling views versus the scroll view, and that being the same as the list view. You can see that in action. This view, for instance, it scrolls real smooth, and it does scroll about this smooth on the G1 as well. That's because it's a scrolling view, not a scroll view. So that's one of the things that I wanted to tell you about. And then, taking that a step further, there are other things you can do to fancy your app a little bit. And one of those things is drag and drop. It was not easy to implement. If you tried, you know what I'm speaking of, especially if you're trying to be backwards compatible. We did implement a drag and drop feature that should work, or works, all the way down to SDK 1.5. So that's one of the things you can and should do if you want to make it look a bit better. Another thing is themable resources. No matter how hard you try with the graphics design, you'll probably always find someone who just will hate your colors that you picked. So the best thing is to think of this right in the beginning, think about this right in the beginning, and implement some kind of theming into your application. The way we did it, we drew all of our resources in white. All backgrounds and icons and everything is drawn in white. And then what we do is we use color filters on the drawables. But in order for you to do that, you need to understand one more concept, and that's the states on the bitmap drawables. It's called, there's a thing called a constant state, and you need to mutate your bitmap drawables in order to use properly the color filters. There's an excellent article about mutating drawable color filters by Roman Guy, and there's a link in the presentation. You don't see it now, but there'll be a link in the end. There's a link in the presentation that will take you to that post of Roman that explains you how to do that properly. So that would be themable resources. And well, beyond the UI, of course, comes very closely connected to that is user experience. And user experience is in our case, number one thing that we would like to mention is that an Android application is not just an application, it's an Android application, meaning it should, when it makes sense, it should interact with other Android applications and the operating system itself. So this includes making widgets. You know, people love widgets. Users love widgets. They ask for widgets, so give them widgets. Another thing is listening for different broadcast intents, if it makes sense. In our case, it did make sense. One of the things that we track is temperature, a morning temperature of the lady. So when she wakes up in the morning, she gets the alarm on the phone, and it's the alarm of the system clock on Android, and we get notified of the alarm, so we can then later track whether or not she has or has not forgotten to enter her temperature that morning. So that would be an example of that. There's also sharing, everything social today, so if there's data that your users would like to share, and by all means, do let them share their data. And they do this actually because they like to chat about these things amongst themselves, I suppose. So that's one thing you shouldn't miss. Well, and then I think it's time to switch back to, if we can we switch back please to the slides? Thank you. Almost, yes. Okay. Oops, there you go, I just missed that. Lessons learned. It's just a small recap of what we found was hard, or what we found was hard was to keep the memory footprint low in our application, and some of the things that you should be careful about when using or programming for Android. If you are implementing a lot of custom views, like we did, as you could see, you end up allocating a lot of bitmaps. Those bitmaps all allocate memory in the native layer in C, and that memory needs to be freed. You can help a great deal to Android, and in former versions, you had to actually call recycle. So I do recommend whenever you allocate a bitmap using a bitmap factory, make sure you're recycling the bitmap, freeing the memory you allocated. Another common thing we all use, I suppose, is a toast. It's really easy, right? You want to display a short message, use toast. One of the parameters you supply is a context. And what's the easiest thing to do is to type get context. That's it. Well, that's the wrong thing to do. You're probably passing in an activity context, and the problem with the toast is that it leaks the context that you pass into it. So please use the application context instead of the activity context. Async tasks. If you're using it, great. If you're not using them, start using them. It's a really good thing in Android. But if you do use them, make sure the return value of your async task is a parameter or something that does not contain a reference to an activity or the context. The reason is it will leak again. And this is not a leak, but it is because of the inherent, the way async tasks work inside Android. They are pooled, and the return value is the reference is held onto in the pool in the underlying layer. So that's the reason you might leak the activity context there as well. Okay, another one is WebView. You can look it up on the slide later if you're interested. This would be the point where we come to a quiz, but I think I'm just going to spare us the awkward silence that would follow if I asked what you thought the worst resource hog in Android was that we came across during this project. And of course, I already fleshed the answer, and it's string format. Never ever use string format where performance matters. What it does, basically, what we need to do, you've seen many times, we need to draw a text, a simple number, on the canvas. And so you would just say, I'll use this innocent-looking function to format a float, say 36.7 float, into the string 36.7, and then use draw text to display that on a bitmap. So that's what we did. And then when we profiled the application and tried to make it really fluid, And what we found out is that one single call to that function to convert one float to a string takes a number of times longer than to repaint the whole screen, which is quite something to say, right? So what we did, we implemented our own string formatter, and that's what I recommend you do as well. So if you take away two things from my part of the presentation, number one, that would be the need, or that you should and probably could easily learn to use scrolling properly, the scroll view. Not the scroll view, but a scrolling view if you need performance scrolling. And the other one is don't use string format. And this is the QR code and the URL to the presentation slides, some of which you have not seen because we were projecting the phone. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you. Cheers. Okay, so unfortunately we've run out of time, so we're going to have to call it a day now so you can get on to your next sessions. But like I said, office hours through there, going to be around all day with my colleagues, so come say hi, come ask any questions, and thank you very much.